In 1995, two long-term researchers of decision-making, Robin Hogarth and Howard Kuhnreuther, published a paper about how people make decisions in the absence of knowledge about outcomes, probabilities, and the consequences of the outcomes. The context they used was the purchase of warranties for consumer goods, such as laptop computers. One of their findings was that a substantial minority of subjects, about 25 to 33%, used what they called a meta-rule for their decision, rather than evaluating specific characteristics of the warranty or the product being purchased. These meta-rules included regret arguments. For example, I would regret not buying the warranty if a breakdown occurred. Generic predictive arguments. For example, products I purchase generally break down. Or a general principle. For example, I never buy this type of warranty. This last kind of meta-rule is interesting because, unlike the others, it doesn't refer to the consequences of buying or not buying the warranty. Instead, it amounts to a moral stance, or what's called a deontological reason, rather than a consequentialist reason for the decision. Deontological refers to the Greek word, deon, for duty. A practical advantage that a deontological reason has over a consequentialist one is that you don't have to know anything about possible outcomes in order to use a deontological reason to make a decision. Deontological reasons can be applied to decisions under ignorance. There are long-running and interesting debates in ethical philosophy that pit deontological and consequentialist justifications against one another. Roughly speaking, the debates concern the morality of basing your decision on whether your choice will yield good outcomes or whether it is the right thing to do. A classic example of deontological versus consequential reasoning is illustrated by the trolley problem, first outlined by the philosopher Philippa Foot in 1967. A runaway trolley is heading down the railway tracks towards 5 people tied up and unable to move. There's no time for you to be able to release the people on the track. You are standing in the train yard, next to a lever. If you pull this lever, the trolley will be diverted onto a side track. However, there is one person on the side track. You have 2 options. Do nothing, and the trolley kills the 5 people on the main track, or pull the lever, diverting the trolley onto the side track where it will kill 1 person. Which alternative will you choose, and why? A consequentialist or utilitarian would argue that losing 5 lives is far worse than losing 1, so the best choice is to pull the lever. But suppose you adhere to the moral principle, do no harm. This is often believed to be part of the original Hippocratic Oath. Then for you, the action of pulling the lever contravenes this principle. Numerous studies have found that a large majority of people say that they would pull the lever, but a non-trivial minority say they would not. Deontological justifications for decisions can be appealing because they can be deployed in situations where we don't know enough to be able to reason consequentially, at least not without having to make a lot of assumptions. But this is because a universal moral principle, such as do no harm or do unto others as you would have them do unto you, doesn't take unknowns into account. They're applied regardless of what may or may not be the case. Introducing unknowns into the runaway trolley scenario illustrates this point. Suppose now that the 5 people aren't tied to the track, but instead are able-bodied men working on the track. They won't become aware of the trolley until it's almost upon them, but it is possible that they might react quickly enough to get out of the way. But the person on the side track is a paraplegic in a wheelchair and is unable to get out of the way if the trolley is diverted onto the side track. Would you pull the lever, betting that fewer people will die if you do than if you don't? What if it's only 2 workmen instead of 5, and so on? The do no harm principle starts to become more compelling as a reason not to pull the lever. That said, the fact that deontological reasoning doesn't deal with unknowns is widely regarded as one of its flaws. There are several kinds of unknowns that make trouble for deontological reasoning. One that we've just seen is probabilistic uncertainty. How likely is it that you will avoid a wrongdoing, or in different circumstances, fulfill your duty or obligation? Another problematic unknown is what moral rule or obligation applies in a particular situation. If there are conflicting moral imperatives, which one has priority? Here's a well-known example. You're a clinical psychologist, and during a therapy session your client admits to beating his wife, but declares a determination to use anger management therapy as a means to avoid doing so in the future. You have 2 conflicting moral imperatives here. duty to uphold the law against domestic violence, and duty to help the client and respect client confidentiality. Should you report your client to the police? Deontological systems are criticized for not dealing with such conflicts in a systematic way, or if they do, for actually resorting to consequentialist arguments to resolve the conflicts. Consequentialism, also called utilitarianism, also has plenty of critics as well. First, consequentialism ignores intentions or motivations. A sinister or malicious act is as well justified as a benign or well-intended act if they have the same consequences. In fact, consequentialism seems to ignore whether an act is illicit or immoral. It's all down to the outcomes. Nothing is sacred or taboo for the utilitarian. Second, there are some problems in formulating exactly what is meant by phrases such as the greatest good for the greatest number. What constitutes the good? Is it to be measured by objective indicators or subjective self-report? And what about the greatest number? Does everybody count equally, or should we give greater weight to the more vulnerable? For instance, more to children than adults, and so on. And third, consequentialism does seem to have a deontological heart after all. The injunction to achieve the greatest good for the greatest number and to maximize expected utility sound a lot like moral imperatives. Can we be persuaded to prefer a deontological or a consequentialist approach, or vice versa? An experimental investigation by Carmen Tanner and Douglas Maden found that framing a decision as a choice between action and inaction tends to induce deontological reasoning, whereas framing it in terms of a positive versus negative outcome induces consequentialist reasoning. But then, they also investigated whether people's own tendency towards deontological versus consequentialist reasoning influences their preferences for action versus inaction, or whether one frame versus another. To see what they found, first we need to understand the scenario they used for their experiment. In a widely studied scenario, we're asked to imagine that a disease has two treatments, A and B. 600 lives will be lost by the disease if no treatment is provided. Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman's original version framed these two treatments in terms of lives saved or lives lost. The lives saved version goes like this. Treatment A will save 200 lives for sure, whereas treatment B has a 1/3 chance of saving 600 lives and a 2/3 chance of saving none. In the lives lost version, treatment A will lose 400 lives for sure, whereas treatment B has a 2/3 chance of losing 600 lives and a 1/3 chance of losing none. The usual framing effect is that most people prefer A in the lives saved frame and B in the lives lost frame. Tanner and Maden modified the scenario by having just one treatment, Plan A, and a default do-nothing, Plan B. They then crossed this with lives saved and lives lost framing to create 4 possible conditions. The first 2 conditions are the lives saved framings. The first framing is that by adopting Plan A, 200 people will be saved for sure, but if nothing is done, Plan B, then there's a 1/3 chance that all 600 will be saved and a 2/3 chance that no one will be saved. The other framing was that by doing nothing, 200 people will be saved for sure, but by adopting Plan A, there's a 1/3 chance that all 600 will be saved and a 2/3 chance that no one will be saved. The second pair of conditions contains the lives lost framings. In the first one, Plan A will lose 400 lives for sure, whereas do-nothing Plan B has a 2/3 chance of losing 600 lives and a 1/3 chance of losing none. In the second one, doing nothing will lose 400 lives for sure, while Plan A has a 2/3 chance of losing 600 lives and a 1/3 chance of losing none. In this and similar scenarios, Tanner and Maden found that people with a strong deontological orientation tended to prefer action over inaction, regardless of whether the result involved risk or not, and regardless of whether the lives saved or lost framing was used. They also found that expected framing effects occurred only for those people with a strong consequentialist orientation. It is possible to have both a strong consequentialist and strong deontological orientation. Both of these effects occurred in people who exhibited strong consequentialist and deontological orientations. Tanner and Maden concluded that deontological and consequential reasoning may operate independently of one another, rather than being mutually exclusive or in opposition. My work shows that they can also operate in tandem. I've conducted an experimental study with the following scenario. As the deputy head of a medical practice, you're in charge of deciding where to send patients' blood samples to be tested for pathogens. For a while, you've been tossing a coin to decide which of 2 pathology labs you will send each sample. You now have 10 test results from Lab A and 10 test results from Lab B. The test result may be positive, evidence for a pathogen in the blood, negative, evidence that there is no pathogen, or no evidence for or against the presence of a pathogen. Turns out that Lab A returns 5 positive and 5 negative results, whereas Lab B returns 3 positive, 3 negative, and 4 no evidence results. The head of the practice wants you to decide which lab to send blood samples to from now on. Which lab would you choose? To complicate matters further, in one experimental condition, the reason for the no evidence results from Lab B is that the test is inconclusive, whereas in the other condition, the reason is that the test results went missing. I found that when the reason was inconclusive tests, 73% of the respondents preferred Lab A, but when the reason was missing results, the percentage increased to 90%. In the second condition, Lab B was culpable for the no evidence cases, whereas in the first condition, it wasn't the lab's fault. Here's an example of a consequentialist preference for conclusive outcomes being amplified by a deontological consideration, namely whether the lab could be blamed for inconclusive outcomes. We began by considering 2 different styles of guidance for our decisions, the good and the right. While most of us use a mixture of these reasons in our decision-making, the way that circumstances are framed can influence us to emphasize one or the other. Deontological reasoning is appealing because it can be used even when we know very little, but one of its drawbacks is that it doesn't take unknowns into account. Consequentialist reasoning does take unknowns into account, but one of its main drawbacks is that it requires a fair amount of knowledge about consequences in order to do so.